Welcome to today's Public Thought Leadership event, Gender Matters, presented by Professor Susanne Gannon. I will begin today's meeting with an acknowledgement of country. With respect for Aboriginal cultural protocols, Western Sydney University Library acknowledges the traditional custodians of the unceded lands and waterways on which our libraries are located and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The university works across many different lands. We are currently joining this meeting from Darug land. We celebrate the knowledge and living cultures of Indigenous Australians and acknowledge their important contribution to teaching, learning and research. We acknowledge that the activities currently delivered across our campuses are a continuation of the teaching and learning that has occurred on these lands for tens of thousands of years. We also pay respect to any First Nations people in the meeting today. In this spirit, we welcome any guests to the meeting. Western Sydney University was placed first in the world in 2022 Higher Times Impact Ratings, the only global performance measure that assesses universities against United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The event series aims to celebrate and promote this #1 ranking, complementing work being undertaken across the university as part of its Sustainable Resilience and Decadal Strategy 2030.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Susanne Gannon, for the 8th event in this Public Thought Leadership Series. We are lucky to have Professor Catherine Holmes, Director of Center for Educational Research, with us today. Professor Holmes will introduce Professor Gannon. Thank you.
Do I have to stand anywhere for the recording?
Let's see.
Over here. Okay. Okay, thank you. Susanne Gannon is a professor in the Centre for Educational Research and is co-leader of our Education, Social Justice and Inclusion Research Group and a member of the WSU Sexualities and Gender Research Group. Susanne researches in gender equity and diversity, educational trajectories, teacher and student subjectivities, writing pedagogies in secondary schools and student, teacher and family experiences of pandemic education. She has undertaken numerous funded research projects, consultancies and competitive tendered research at regional, state and federal levels and collaborates with researchers in Canada, the UK, Europe and Latin America. She is current co-editor of the journal Gender and Education and regional editor of International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. They're very busy. Prior to commencing at the university, Susanne was a secondary school teacher for more than 15 years across several states. Extended secondments as a curriculum advisor enabled her to work with teachers across regional Queensland to support curriculum and pedagogy. And as an equity programs officer based in Brisbane, she supported gender equity initiatives across that state. She currently leads an ARC discovery grant entitled Gender Matters, Changing Policy and Practices in Australian Secondary Schools, which is the focus of today's presentation. So would you please welcome Susanne Gannon.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, to any First Nations people who may be here today online or in person. And I'd also like to recognise that this land has never been ceded. It is now, will be, has always been Aboriginal land, and I can't wait until we have that recognition embedded in our constitution and our democratic practices in this country, which I hope will happen very soon. So I've taken this opportunity, the public thought lecture, I've taken it very literally. What does it mean to give a public thought lecture? I'm not in a SIG where everybody is reading the same things and we're all citing each other. I'm in a public space. So I want to tell a story that's, accessible to the public. And I also, whoever they may be, whenever, because the library hosts this recording on the website. And there's also an element of thinking in public, a large element of thinking in public in the sense of thinking out aloud. I want to explore ideas with you in an open-ended sort of a manner, resisting absolute truth claims or incontrovertible evidence. I'm going to share with you some research sort of that we're in the thick of thinking about. So with research, we often talk about findings, and I think that's our goal, our end point, supposedly. But findings for me is often a point when there's an unfurling of more questions, provocations to keep thinking, to keep talking, to keep listening and learning how to appreciate where people are coming from, people who aren't me, people who may not think like me, and where we might meet in the shared purpose of social justice, equity, democracy and inclusion. So this is my abstract, and it's basically, I wanted to talk about the project. I'm grappling with the data, the huge volume of data that we have from at the moment. And I'd want to acknowledge Prue Adams, who's in the room, who is a fantastic person working on that project. With me, Kerry Robinson, and also Erica Smith, an invaluable person, a great little team, a very small team for a very large project. So I want to situate, how and what ways does gender matter? How are pedagogies, practices and policies influenced by understandings of gender? What old ideas and approaches persist? And how do these need to change? I hope to have some answers to this soon, but I'm not there yet. I'm going to share the multiplicity of voices with you, the diversity of what we're hearing from the people that we spoke to. I hope that's all right. This is why we've got these screens activated around the wall. So I've got too much busy stuff on the slides. Sorry about that. How are young people, teachers and school leaders responding to contemporary notions of gender? And how has feminist thinking and praxis been effective in the past? What does it mean now for schools to be inclusive, safe spaces for all students of all genders to thrive? I think that's why all of us who've ever been involved in education, why we're there. We want young people to thrive. We want our society to thrive, whoever and wherever people are located. It's very normal in feminist research, I think, to situate ourselves in any reflexive research. So, I just thought I'd borrow this definition of gender justice from an interesting website. So it's not usual to get a definition from a website, but I really like this one. Gender justice seems to work for me. A world where all people can thrive, regardless of their gender expression or their sexual orientation. So situating me, I am a cisgender woman. That is, the gender that I present as is in alignment with the gender that I was identified with at birth. Pronouns, it's conventional to identify how you expect to be approached. I'm fine with she, her, many other monikers at different times, but those are my pronouns. I have always considered myself to be a feminist, even as feminist thinking has shifted through the course of my life. I'm a teacher, as Kat said. I was a teacher for a long time in schools, a researcher, and I also think of myself very much as a qualitative researcher, as a storyteller, and as a conveyor of the stories that other people have shared with me as well. So just some, throughout this talk, I'm going to cite a lot of really fabulous Australian researchers who've researched in Australian schools. So Jill Blackmore and Julie McLeod, for example, interesting, who have been working in this space for decades and decades and decades. Maybe there's one too many decade in there. Don't want to age them too much. But anyway, so feminism, Jill Blackmore says recently, an assemblage of epistemological, political, social, economic movements and positionings which are highly situated but have familial resemblances. The common aim is gender justice. Don't buy, just a warning, don't buy some of the my position is that we should not buy some of the arguments that are being pitched to us in the public from certain quarters that feminism is averse to other modes of gender inclusion. I don't think that is necessary or useful. Julie McLeod, excellent thinker, Concurrently, the key words of feminism and gender are undergoing a process of historical transformation. We should hope that any thinking does this, actually, and a reconfiguring of what they signify. So I hope that what we'll see in some of the quotes I'm going to share with you from our participants will give you some sort of inklings of those changes. This is the argument we put for the research when we wrote. This grant application went in 7 times. So finally, I think this is the last version of it. It started as when somebody in the research office asked me, what would be your dream project? And I thought, oh, what's the one that would bring together what I was involved in as a teacher, a curriculum consultant, and a researcher? And it was this sort of space. So gender issues are contentious but inconsistently addressed. Whether or not that's possible is another question. Concerns about gendered violence, everyday experience of sexual harassment and gender-based violence. However, they're masked by what are supposedly gender neutral school policies and practices. School responses, often stereotypical, homophobic and now transphobic harassment rife. And in research, for example, by our wonderful colleagues Tanya Ferfolya and Jackie Allman, persistently people say after they've left school, that was the worst place for me to be. Teachers are apprehensive and fearful, and most education departments have abandoned gender-related initiatives. I don't want to read every slide because I'll never get through them because there's way too many, so I'll try to be a bit faster. So our research brief, I'm really sorry, I thought I was going to be in a big lecture theatre, but it's a tutorial room, so not great display. There are 3 phases. So these were our 3 questions. You should be able to see them on a screen. Phase 1 was looking at people who worked in the gender policy space 20 years ago, interviewing people who'd been in bureaucracies and all different spaces. Phase 2, our first people in the present that we interviewed were recent school leavers from New South Wales schools who were current Western Sydney University students. 49, actually, I think it's 48 because one was from Vietnam. We had to eliminate that person. Focus groups, art making workshops. You can ask Prue or me about this. Prue is deeply immersed in every part of this and responsible for the art making workshops. The third part was when we went into schools. I could talk for hours about that, but I won't. We ended up going into schools in another state, not in New South Wales. But our question there was, how is gender shaping the lived experience of students in schools? And how do school leaders and teachers think about that? So, is gender relevant? Interestingly, and I'm taking a big scope to, what is gender? What do we include? What do we exclude from that? Interestingly, the first time I put this grant application in, I quoted Julie McLeod, who said gender is a disappearing category in 2012. Now we've got the biggest moral panics are around gender, it seems, but not just these little headlines just from the last few days, of course, the top layer, but that's just a collection of articles that we pulled down. We could have had 20 times this many during the course of this research, where there's some link with something to do with our wide scope of what we think about when we think about gender. So because I've been working in the space in my pre-university life, there's a little bit of a back and forth movement. So I did promise, I don't know how this will go, but anyway, I'll give it a try. I thought I'd drop in, I said I'd tell some stories. So I've got 2 stories from my early life as a teacher. And they, I could do 50 stories from then. I've just randomly plucked 2. And then I wanted to show you some of what we found in the 3 parts of the research. So picture this, my first story, practicum. Everybody knows about teacher prac, my first prac. I'm in a large co-ed Perth state school, famous for a mass caning the year before. A car had been stolen, 40 boys. A car had been stolen and set fire to on the school oval. 40 boys had been lined up and caned. Because of course caning, a state-sanctioned form of violence against children, is only done to boys. And why 40? Well, I guess boys don't dob. There's something about the performance of young masculinity at the time, perhaps, bravado, risk-taking, loyalty, a sort of camaraderie that forms in opposition to authority that maybe made this possible. I didn't interview those boys. I'm not sure. It's just my hunch. My first class, the class I'm with for the next month, Year 10 English, they're streamed. The moment that the classroom door opens, first morning, first day of prac, this school, the kids call out en masse, "Hi, miss, we're basic." The options in a Perth school, a Western Australian state school, were basic, standard and advanced. Of course, as a prac teacher, I didn't lay my eyes on an advanced class, but I had no trouble with these kids. Of course, trouble is the main concern for beginning teachers who are being assessed on their prac. We got through that trial together. What they learnt from me, I've got no idea, but there were 28 boys and 3 girls in that class. What I learned from them, again, what I probably already knew, because I had been teaching in Aboriginal schools before that, was how, without a qualification, but was how institutional structures produce injustice and inequity, and how discourses or ways of speaking and thinking about ourselves, each other and the world produce rationalities and practices that keep inequities in place. To locate this in the context of the times, it was soon after this that Wayne Martino, now living in Canada, began his PhD on masculinities in secondary English in another WA school. So I'm running with masculinities now because this is just the first story that occurred to me, my first day of prac. In my dip ed, we were reading from Murdoch, we were reading the pioneering text in the sociology of education in Australia, published just 2 years earlier, Doug Ashenden and Raewyn Connell's Making the Difference, Schools, Families and Social Division. Gender was not an explicit focus of that work, but soon Connell moved to California and began developing what was called the new sociology of masculinities. On her website, Connell references the first use of the term hegemonic masculinity to that 1982 book, noting in the empirical work they'd done in secondary schools in Sydney, it had become clear that there were hierarchies of masculinities that shaped students' experiences and opportunities. Meanwhile, in English, my main teaching area, new curriculum for secondary school gradually came to be informed by aspects of post-structural theory that enabled us to identify, interrogate and deconstruct dominant discourses of gender, class, race and other social categories as they materialised in texts. Texts expanded to include everyday texts, media texts, non-fiction texts alongside canons of literature and young adult fiction that we were more used to. Here's a few of the resources and interrogations of masculinity from that period, like around about a 10-year period probably, all done in Australia except for these last 2. So these big names in educational research, Bob Lingard, Martin Mills, Wayne Martino, Rob Gilbert, Pam Gilbert, a wonderful scholar, like several we know, taken way too early from us. Maria Pulotta-Chirola with Wayne Martino. Practical resources for schools here, for English teachers here, Wayne Martino's work with Bronwyn Malore. You'll remember that, Wayne, probably. And this wonderful resource, the Gen, a newsletter that came into every school as far as I know. Every school in the state, maybe once in the country, maybe once a month. That one's from March 1994 and landed on the staff room table, at least in the school I was in, that had something to do, stories about what people were doing around gender. It was a really busy, super wonderful time, I think. Connell's wonderful book, incredible book, Masculinities, came out in the mid-90s first, I think. And here, you can't see the names there, but Jane Kenway and Anna Hickey-Moody was working on that project. And most recently, Anna Hickey-Moody's book, Deleuze and Masculinities, and Amanda Keddy's work that just came out last year, super interesting. And I want to sort of map a bit of a shift of thinking. So in the early work, here's one, there was a lot around boys and literacy way before we've come to understand that work was visible. This, in the early 1997, Nola Alloway, Pam Gilbert, made it in an article in Gender and Education, the journal I edit now, co-edit. They talked about how whether literacy was a domain of knowledge and a set of technologies that run counter to various dominant discourses of masculinity. Raewyn Connell, it's a shift, it's not all in curriculum, there's a shift away, the sociology stuff was less. And Connell talked about the diversity of masculinities and the intersections of gender with race, class, nationality, and we would add more to that list now. And Kenway, I don't know why that's there, Luke, your name is going to block everything. So in Kenway's work, they were not interested in curriculum. So they were looking at knowledge-based identity work that happens in opposition to and outside schools. They did longitudinal research and went back and spoke to the same people year after year, as did Amanda Keddy in her series of work from her PhD. So this really, really recent work from Anna Hickey-Moody and Amanda Keddy is sort of a bit indicative of how the language has changed and the tools for thinking that we have. So Hickey-Moody's work is really interesting and really theoretically complex and challenging, but she has been working in this space for quite a long time. So here, gender performance that is popularly recognised as masculinity is fluid in the different ways it embodies these sorts of qualities. Masculinity, she says, is a powerful social fiction around which bodies and subjectivities are organised. It seems so controversial, perhaps, if you've never thought that way. How do we perform and maintain the practices that we come to understand as representing masculinity, femininity, whatever. We could slot femininity into some of these slots too. Gender is messy and already an ongoing act of creation. Judith Butler's work has been influential there too. So some of the queer theory influences were about we perform gender. It's something that we have to work at it. Oh, sorry, I can't get rid of that there, and I can't see what's on the slide. But Amanda Keddy's really interesting little book, just a thin one, it's fantastic. She's gone back and revisited all the work from one student who she interviewed first for her PhD in primary school and is now 28. So how does that person, one person, construct himself as a young man in Australia in all the spaces of his life? And she uses the concept of affective intensities, which seems to be really productive and what I'm thinking through at the moment. But you can see the sort of language that started to emerge in more recent times, affect, emotion, how that dynamic space that's more than reason, performativity, becoming, intersectionality. We can never forget the complexities of masculinities and all the constellations of identity that influence all of us as we take ourselves up as gendered. So another story, this is the last one I promise you. If I can find this, picture this. In my school in the early 90s, we're allowed to teach human relationships education at last in Queensland because Bjelke Petersen is no longer the Premier. Takes a bit of time, but the HRE curriculum, as we called it, statewide. It's developed with local consultative committees with central guidance. There's regional advisors. There's an equity unit in head office in Brisbane, a network across the state that is in turn networked across the whole country. We consult with the students in our school. What do they think they need to know? We develop programs in our school. We consult with the students, parents. We collaborate with local partners and NGOs, family planning, the local rape crisis centre. Both of them have full-time educators working with schools, communities and other institutions like the police force, the judges, the local AIDS council we work with. We work collaboratively to skill ourselves and each other as we developed and adapted lessons, resources, programs for each level. You know, it wasn't utopian, but don't mean to give that impression, but there was a lot of really busy, engaged work going on. One semester, family planning ran a private drop-in space at our school for students to consult privately on sexual health. We called our program at that school Maraba, which was hands together in the local Jabbergai language. We did a lot of work on communications and so on. I'm invited to join the management committee of the local rape crisis centre, where over the next few years I learn much more about sexual assault in my town than I had ever wanted to. Where are we now? I'll just go. Now, human relationships education, sex education, respectful relationships education tends to be buried in PDHPE or outsourced to external providers, like the providers doing consent education in a lot of schools. However, excellent resources have been developed and evaluated. In Victoria, this project from Helen Cahill and Barak Dadvan at Melbourne Uni, this phenomenal project curriculum that Debbie Ollis has worked on. These are people who've worked in this space. Debbie Ollis as well, she's a legend, for decades. This is a model from that curriculum and resource pack for a whole school approach. So they're not talking about squeeze it into PDHP. They're talking about what does it mean to organise a school that is sensitive to power relations and all sorts of things that are seen to impact on gender. This kit's like this one, and Kerry Robinson, I must say, has been working for decades in this space as well. This kit landed in every school, as far as I know, around Australia as well. It was developed in Canberra in the equity unit, equity programs unit, and there's a primary version and a secondary version. That was about consent education in part. So finally, in 1995, I was seconded to a school support centre. I worked with a new English curriculum, and policy documents landed in our office, like the gender equity framework, which is what I'm going to talk about next. And then I spent some time in Brisbane, another secondment, helping to implement that or work around the issues in that, delivering PD to teachers around southeast Queensland on all sorts of issues to do with gender, including boys' education. So you can see I've written a little bit about these. That's some publications in the last couple of years that touch on that historical stuff. So I think my time is really rushing away. So the three parts of our project in the present. I already said we looked at the people who'd worked on this document from 1997 in some way or other. Some of them were in far distant reaches of regions. Some of them were in the head office in Canberra. Some of them were in the state equity units that existed at that time. Stephen Ball says, I think the only person I've quoted from outside Australia, but there you go. The hewers and drawers of policy work, the people who do the labour, are usually invisible. So we were interested in, I was interested in talking to them. So I wanted to, there's a complicated chronology of policy in this space in Australia. You can see girls, 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 girls. I mean, all founded on a lot of evidence from research that had been done about issues relating to education inequities for girls. Girls, Then we've got a bit of a move to gender, 1996, and then 1997, we've got gender equity, a framework for Australian schools, and we've got boys. Can I say what's called the competing victims discourse where we pit boys and girls has never been successful. It is not a productive way to go about transforming and inclusion, towards an inclusive sort of atmosphere. I just wanted to point out this policy here, which was the National Action Plan for Girls, which was meant to be implemented at the same time as this gender equity framework, the only national policy we've ever had. It had 8 priorities, some of which disappeared when they tried to go gender neutral because you couldn't address issues relating to girls at risk, particularly parenting and pregnant girls. That sort of disappeared out of the next policy. But anyway, I could talk about them forever. I'll try not to. This policy had 5 strategic directions rather than that 8. You can see the first one was understanding the process of gender construction. You might have heard some conservative political people of high profiles ranting about the construction of gender. This is from 1997. It's not a brand new idea. And there were many, many people in education looking pretty productively, I think, at around this space at that time and since. Curriculum reform, gendered violence and sex-based harassment. That's what Kerry Robinson's PhD looked at. Sexual harassment in secondary schools. In, I think about 1995, she did that work. Post-school pathways. We're in an engineering building. I look at the screen out there for the car challenge. Out of the 19 people, it's not very even, but anyway. So this is where I'm getting messy. I'm really sorry about that, but I'm just throwing a whole lot of quotes from the people working in 1997, 6, 5, around that space. The principle, what amazes me is how resonant some of these comments are. The 3-parent rule. Schools are held ransom by the most conservative, outspoken parents in the community. This was somebody who's an academic actually now, but who was very busy in that space. He actually threatened to sue us. A consultant in boys education who was made these people rewrite sections of their book. He went on to say, he makes a career of suing academics. Anyway, this person in Queensland, my epistle to the DG, coming back with a handwritten note that said, I never want to receive another one of these from you ever. Underlined. Porn in my pigeonhole. This was the person in Canberra who wrote that policy. Really, most responsible director of that unit. Our only hope for the defending the ground was bringing in boys and making it gender broadly. We lost, it didn't work. Now, by that, I've written quite a bit about this. It was a change in government. John Howard was elected in and the work finished really. It didn't work. If we hadn't done it, we would have lost it earlier. It was absolutely clear that the boys thing was the biggest thing threatening us. I mean, the boys thing, we could spend hours unpacking what that means, but there were men and women working in this space. These come from people in all different locations and so on. And it seemed to me we could, the vast evidence that I have from these interviews is about these sorts of ideas, the macro politics of a government changing and their priorities changing, the microaggressions that people got in conference spaces. They talked about like really being bodily pressured, overt threats, moral panics and risk aversion, a bruising battle. So moving right along to the present. The second phase of our research was with our Western Sydney University students, right? 19 to 24. And Prue was there for lots of them. I've just picked out, a few issues. And an uncannily interesting one that I'm working with at the moment is school uniforms, like who knew? But things that, you know, shape bodies and police student bodies are really, when you ask people a few years later, you know, how is gender impacting on your experience at school? They tell us about school uniforms. Amazing. And so we had 18 focus groups, 48 participants, 35 identified as female, 11 identified themselves as male, 2 identified themselves as gender diverse. We didn't ask them in the interviews. They registered for the focus groups. 17 of them went to single-sex schools and 35 went to co-ed schools. I'm trying to write about the single-sex schools now. It's so difficult and interesting. 9 of them went to independent schools, 13 to Catholic schools, 30 to government schools. And these are our typical Western Sydney University students and citizens. They speak Persian, Farsi, Arabic, Tagalog, Urdu, Hindi, Vietnamese, Bengali, Gujarati, Spanish, Fanti, Yui. They came from all different degrees and faculties, including this building, engineering, and the art making workshops ask Prue about that. That's her area of expertise. And we were interested in the voices of young people. So what happens when you get all these voices? My gosh, there's so many and they say such different things. I just thought I'd share some of what they said. So I've tried to, this is so interesting. 2 of them said, at a boys' school, you don't need a gender policy. And another one said in a different focus group, I'm not too sure if I could speak on gender equity because we were a single-sex school. Like this is something that belongs to that other, only to a co-ed school or a co-ed world, which is what we live in as far as I know. So what, you know, to summarise what we found from the Western Sydney University students, probably that the mutability of the concepts and the discourses of gender equity, widely confusing. And pretty well the quotes I've got were in response to this question. Did your school have any gender equity policies? What do you understand by gender equity? We didn't define gender. We wanted them to, which is probably, we could have got tidier responses if we had. So so there's pretty conventional ones. Equal opportunities for women and men, opportunities being career, whether you get paid the same amount. But then this person says in the middle, it's such a broad term, but it doesn't get the time of day by people, in authorities, by the authority, because mainly they are the dominant, males are the dominant gender currently. It's been running like that for so long they don't want to change because, you know, no one really likes change. My school failed on both gender equity and equality because they were trying to differentiate using that little meme of the boxes and the football field. Anyway, it's another story. There was this is very common, this sort of benign neglect, if you like. There was equality of opportunity in that there was no discouragement. There was no policies in place giving for or against. Like maybe if you were on a science scholarship, they might be like, hey, should you be doing science? But that would be it. But we had 5 women total in the whole science thing and only in biology. So it was clearly not equality of outcome. But then we got a lot of other sort of newer ideas like these. This was from our very first focus group. It was pretty amazing. Like how do we not show an emotion? Now in society, there's 33 identifiable genders. So that needs to be taken into account. It's ever changing. Whatever gender you present yourself is respected. Who you are is respected. Being treated with the same level of respect. For all genders, before anything else, we are all human. For all types of genders, not being biased. Different things from person to person. There couldn't really be a set kind of definition. So, you know, in terms of reducing data and generalizing from it, it's really messy and it's really interesting. But there's so much choice and freedom, more choice and freedom. This, I think, was the overall impression we got from all our students. And this is, you know, we didn't have all woke queer students coming. We had students from all backgrounds and perspectives. So what I'm trying to work through now is if I use that idea that Amanda Keddy's working with of affective intensities and looking at little micro narratives in their stories, different ways people have looked for affective intensities in research data, hotspots when emotions run high, points when there's different movements and different thoughts. And Amanda Keddy and Garth Stahl argue in another paper that this is where new challenges to thinking happen in those moments. And in our work, we had focus groups on university campus. People were all very well behaved, pretty well. Only one I think we had to take for a coffee and a cry afterwards, but they were not spectacular outbursts, but they were subtle and ordinary sorts of moments. We asked them, how did gender impact on your and your peers' experience of high school? So here's the uniform business. The principal even said, I don't want to see your butt cheeks to the girls. We had a transgender person who had to really fight. This documentation of all the policing of the uniform policy went on for a bit longer than that, but I was really struck by, if your hair's too short, go home for 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, really? Isn't school about learning? This is before online learning. We had a joke that our high school strived to be a private school with how strictly uniforms were enforced. You'd be happily eating a sandwich, have to get up and kneel. So she could grab a ruler. We'd get demerit points. The first day of year 7, orientation day, one of my peers, her socks were rolled down a little bit too low. She got a demerit point on the spot. The first day of high school, the first hour of high school. Now, I went to a girls' Catholic school in the 1970s. These stories are not different. They seem more repressive, but anyway. Then inconsistencies. And they vary. I haven't labelled the types of school these people are at or even the genders of the students at this point. In terms of the boys, I mean, obviously we're in a different sort of school. That's the other school, you had to have your hair not too short. This one, you can't have a beard. What are they anxious about? What's the moral panic there of what a bearded student would represent? No rules for the guys at all. The girls did anything, it was detention, suspension, everything. We also have, really interesting stories. This one here, about the inclusion of a special uniform as being a practice of cultural and gender inclusion. One of the parents introduced a new uniform. The school agreed and made a specific customised uniform for our type of Islamic. This is a student in a government school, actually. A maxi, kind of like a dress and pants. We never thought they would accept a secular government school, but they actually did. And these are the decisions that might keep a student at that school instead of the private Islamic school down the road, perhaps. Bendel skirts to the knee. If it's higher than that, men get the wrong idea. Girls this is not a government school, had to wear all hijabs. Even if they didn't wear it out of school, you had to wear it around the school. Only green, or if you wore a black headband, you would get in a lot of trouble. This school, they changed the rules for girls. Mufti, you could wear half mufti, you can wear a third mufti, you can't wear that, you can't wear that. You can wear certain shirts, you're paying $2 to wear a different shirt, but it has to be a certain shirt. Then the guys just come in full mufti. We came out shaking our heads like, oh, I was to be here. Wow. Anyway, I'm sorry just to throw this at you. I'm throwing my affective intensity is interacting with the data. So curriculum, I know there's people in this room interested in science, so I pulled a bit of this out. They didn't discourage it, they didn't encourage it. If you want to talk about numbers, physics started out with 3 females, ended with 1. Software design never had any. Physics, 3 other girls, the rest were guys. The teacher came to the girls' students and were like, just drop out of the unit. I'm sure if we interviewed the teacher, they'd say, I never said that. Maybe they didn't say it very often, but maybe the kid misheard it. But if that's the feeling that you have, if that's the memory that you have, that's pretty dire. Drop out of physics. It made me feel anxious going into class. I kept telling myself I'm not going to drop out of physics because of a teacher. I felt very anxious, very biased. Everyone in the class could tell. When there's physics, people just think, oh, this is boys in physics, I'm not going to do physics. Now, we had a great big grant in the early mid-90s when I first, pretty soon after I came here, about ICT and gendered pipelines. It's just really sad to hear this persistence of this sort of feeling like you're not in the space. Another really interesting one is the story around sex education. So I'm finding out from others, this is somebody who's doing secondary teacher education. I'm finding out from others, their peers, I got no sex ed. I hear from people at other public schools and co-ed schools, they explained a lot more things. They're trying to teach all the Catholic values and you should have abstinence and whatnot. Go off and learn it yourself. Risky situations occurring because you're not informed. Now, this person did not describe what the risky situations were, but, you know, I can unfurl a million answers to that question. Some of them are about consent. But he says it was KFC, my part-time job, where I learned to talk to another woman that was my age. And they'd gone to the public school. That's where I learnt what I needed to know to be a functioning young person in this society. Yes, a tiny little bit from another interview talking about their friends at another school. They knew nothing. They didn't know yes and no. They didn't know what being pressured and coerced into sex was. I don't know, you know, when we had the consent, all the media reporting about what their schools that were named in Chanel Contessa's report, you'll remember a few years ago, were the testimonies that she collected. Those schools' responses were usually, we're getting in this external provider to teach them about consent. I think it's bigger and broader and, you know, getting in at some highly paid consultant for a day might not be enough. Anyway, so sexual harassment, more ubiquitous sort of. They'd harass me, they'd touch me, I'd get so uncomfortable the teachers turned a blind eye. Homophobic slurs were thrown around, especially males, that when they would do something that would be considered kind of feminine, the F slur. There was no talk, no meeting, no proper intervention. It was left under the rug and just brushed away. People would put notes, post-it notes up right under tables, gossip spread, sexual assault, sexist remarks, any issues the girls had. It was a long issue of just drama and trying to minimise the issue or waiting for it to pass. Girls dragged into storage rooms, the photography dark room. Most of the time it was the boys chasing the girls. If anyone was caught, it was always the girl was blamed regardless of whatever happened. So, you know, if I can sum up, there seemed to be a sense among the students across a number of the focus groups where this sort of thing was discussed, ubiquitous sort of neglect. Schools that were at best reactive, more often inactive, and Tanya and Jackie have written a lot about the culture of limitations in schools. Very interesting. And Leanne Hyam has some beautiful new work on slow violence in schools that gradually builds up and accumulates. So, got a little bit more time if you don't mind me just banging on to our next. So we haven't been in schools yet. We wanted to, you know, that was the crux of our project, was to talk to people in schools. We talked to young people, teachers, principals. We talked to people who, actually someone who worked in the SERAP office at the time, to principals, you know, before, just when we first got the grant, they all, oh, that sounds great, that sounds wonderful, but we could not get through the ethics obstacles to do research in New South Wales. So what we know of New South Wales schools in any sector is from the very subjective reports, of course, whose reports aren't subjective, of these recent school graduates who came to our focus groups. But we did, I could talk about this forever, I won't. We had, this is the side where we tried to work in New South Wales schools. We went to, don't even think we went to the Catholic Education Office in the end. We were just so weighed down by the disasters. We almost had a school on board, and then I cannot not say Mark Latham was involved in some of this. We were mentioned in tweets, we were mentioned in Hansard that the research was stopped. Anyway, as you know, Mark Latham was, until recently, I hope, or imminently, the chair of the New South Wales Education Committee of Parliament, and very, very influential and very active in intervening. Whereas we thought our questions were pretty benign, actually. What is, kids talking about physics. So we went to the ACT. So I've got no notes on that. I'm sorry, I just had a little rant then. I've really held myself back, but there you go. So we did, rather than the long period of time we wanted to work, we did quick runs and spent a couple of days in the schools. Prue, you can talk to, spent more time there. She went back and did art making workshops. But we got a huge amount of data, really beautiful, deep insights, I think. And the ACT has very progressive policies. It prides itself on being a progressive jurisdiction in Australia. Some of what the policy director told me was off, when I had the phone turned off, sadly. But they have, for example, this supporting students affirming gender at school policy, a good practice guide. There's a lot of resources for principals in government schools. Many students talked to us. We spoke to year 11 and 12 students, mostly year 11, who had were in senior colleges. So it's a different system there. And they, quite a few of them talked to us about leaving other systems to come to government schools for their year 11 and 12. So our case studies, we had 10 focus groups, 32 participants. We had 20 teachers who were school exec, the policy director, the one policy director. And we were interested in the voices of teachers and voices of young people. Now, by now, I'll just point out to you, this is DALL-E. Aren't we all fascinated by AI? This is DALL-E's version of a pop art style diverse Australian high school students in a corridor. It's just the most bizarre, weird. They are never going to take over. AI is never going to take over art making, in my view. But anyway, I just put that there for your entertainment. So the ACT Directorate of Education, they have a very robust, it appears, inclusion and wellbeing policy. This is where they locate most of these practices. So, yep, this is what the policy officer said. A few little snapshots of things that we talked about earlier and that came up for us in new ways there. Uniform, it's in government schools in the ACT. Schools should make sure your uniforms aren't boys or girls' uniforms. They're uniforms. Online enrolments. A lot of people talk to us about this. So people enrol their kid online, and in the registration form, they can have preferred name and an option for how they identify their gender. This is a bureaucratic form, and it says male, female, non-binary or other. It takes the heat out. It's takes the drama out. In some ways. They have a great big annual International Women's Day event that a lot of people talk to us about, a lot of kids talk to us about. The kids come together with the directorate and identify ways that they can do better. In schools, they pitch a response to a problem that's resourced for the winners, and they try it out in the school. There's phenomenal initiatives on student voice in all of these schools. There's student voice committees. There's ally groups. I don't know, we could talk about them for ages, couldn't we, Prue? It's not utopia. We had a teacher, we didn't have people cry in our focus groups with students, but we did have a teacher in the ACT cry in an interview, which is really shocking. So not a utopia, but they're trying hard to build an inclusive environment. And they've got, we could talk about that further later. So what did the students in the ACT, they were much more overt in what they said about gender and sexuality diversity. So my friend was able to go up in front of the year 7 group, this is in the high school, and tell them all that that's who they were and there was nothing big made of it. it all turned out really well. It all went really smoothly. It's like the heat and drama are taken out. It's not that hard to use someone's pronouns. It's just 2 words to make them feel infinitely more comfortable. We don't want kids to drop out of school because they feel uncomfortable. You know, that the impact of leaving school early is so severe. This commitment to inclusive, supportive, safe environments is really impressive, I think. The students there were pretty happy to identify themselves in different ways. I think Prue did some of these on a road. We were like driving over the ACT all over Canberra, crossing over. It was pretty bizarre. So this might have been from one that you had, Prue. As someone who identifies as non-binary, it's either all this stuff, you've got to be male or female, there's no in between, it's just kind of expected. One of my friends was put in a class with a teacher who'd never had a trans student before, insisted on keep calling him her, referred to him as his dead name, just refused to do things. As soon as he was put out of the class into a different one, the teacher respected everything because it was in the system. I mean, that it's in the system, takes the heat out. It's the teachers told us they read the role, how it appears to them in the morning. It's not a drama. We don't have to take a moral stand. We just have to make schools safe places, in my view. Sorry, I went a bit off then. For people who identify as non-gender binary, there's just a dot on the enrolment form, which is good. I do have to correct them sometime. People get it wrong. That's all right. It's not a drama. That's normal. And yeah, so these are the things that, as I said, there's a lot of ally groups. The ally groups are frustrated in some schools because not enough people came to them. They're like, yeah, it's not an issue. And they're like, we want more people to come. We're selling the cakes. We're painting the room with rainbows. What do the teachers, the principals say? I haven't pulled out the teachers, just some of the principals. One of the challenges, so what principal says, one of the challenges is getting my pronouns right. I try to unwind that and say, I'm sorry. The principals were all middle-aged, you know, like me. But this principal went on to say, it makes me feel strong as an educator in public education when we get a student coming here because they've heard it's a safe place for them. It's a really nice thing to have that brand in the community. I even heard before I went to Canberra from a parent who said about the safe, certain schools having reputations. So there's a growing understanding. The old-fashioned things, the things we kept hearing from the students in New South Wales were around school uniform, sex education. This principal said, when you're in my position, you have to explain the reason why. You have to be so much better at this is the why and these are the benefits. I guess we all need to do that. I was speaking to an information night 3 years ago and a parent came up to this principal and said, you said sons and daughters, you're leaving out some of your population. I said, thank you for that. So I've addressed it. In all my documents, I used to have sons and daughters. I don't. I have students, your children. I mean, that was a little bit frustrating for the principal. You know, they get things wrong unintentionally. Guess what? We all do all the time. We used to have these symbols, and they also, in their inclusion practices, they had very good school support services. So they had, I think, 4 in some schools, didn't they? Student support officers who were very experienced teachers. And in the little foyer of one of those, we used to have posters up, these symbols up for all of the different gender groups, but some people complained that some people is the students who and said they left somebody and included someone else who shouldn't be there, so we withdrew it. You can never get it right. We believed we were doing the right thing. We got it wrong. There's like little bombs everywhere that go off, but they get through them because their biggest story is how can we make this inclusive for all students? We want to keep them here to get them through to the end of their school education. Some come here and find the environment safe, supportive, welcoming, and this was something we heard in very similar wording from a lot of people. You can be whomever you would like to be. They feel very comfortable to start a journey. So I think we got the sense that all the teachers and the principals and everybody is starting a journey. And it seems a whole school and system commitment to inclusion is the journey that they're on. And I don't know what's on the next slide. I'll just move on. Anything else I'm cherry picking sort of in a way across the whole lot of our data. We were surprised at how much this came out, but given it's so much in the media, the moral panic around gender diversity and the sustained efforts to split feminism or feminists from and pit them against each other, against gender diverse peoples. I think it's really interesting to see how a large-ish education system sort of just being there with their kids where they are and supporting them. So, that's right, I've just got a slide with some of the most fabulous researchers in this space. You know, Tanya Fafolia and Jackie Allman. They finished their great book on cultures of limitations with this sort of utopian, hopeful orientation, which I think should be part of all of us as people committed to gender justice. We're aware a more expansive countercultural shift is already and always in motion. We can imagine its growth and influence and commit to working for a system of education in which cultivating socially responsible, emotionally intelligent, aware and proactive young people, they were certainly proactive in the ACT, is just as important as cultivating their academic skills. We have people in our schools, not robots that we're pouring curriculum into. And Debbie Ollis, who's worked in this space from the beginning of the 90s, she's talked about, she's drawing on Rosie Bradotti in this quote, issues of gender and sexualities are not simply a case of inclusion, exclusion, discrimination, affirmation. Sexuality issues pervade every aspect of our teaching and learning experiences. That's a really interesting challenge to think about. They are encoded in rules, policies, curriculum content, the unofficial and official school spaces, content and pedagogical practices. We need, quoting Bradotti, practices of hope and ways of dreaming up possible futures. And that's where I'll end. We've got a whole lot of references that are, could have been 3 times as long, but if you want it, it's on paper somewhere around the room. So I think that was just a sort of mid-process thinking, oversharing, rather than a resolution of anything. But I hope that it's like working with talking to these young people, their teachers, has, helped us to think differently and to try really hard to see the world from the points of view of others and try and meet where people are. And I hope that there's been a little glimmer of that for everybody who's here today. Thank you. Sorry, 3 minutes over time. Questions? Oh, it's no time. I'm happy to take a few questions. There's no tutorials in this room, or you can ask questions by email. Hold on, should be writing about this rather than answering too many emails. Do we want to ask if anybody online wants to ask a question? And I'm absolutely aware that this is still, I'm in the thick of thinking. I don't have completely resolved this for you. I hope to have soon. We've got a special issue of a journal coming out that we're writing for now, and a book proposal that I'm editing with people from New Zealand and the UK that we hope will be accepted as well. I just wanted to go to the Zoom to see if anybody had a question. So, I thought that I'd share that with you because nobody at this university really knows much about what we've done. We've jumped in the car and driven to Canberra. We've gone off to Parramatta to do focus groups. We've done all sorts of things like that. But no, we haven't really spoken to people about it much.
Good. I was interested, as you know, in what you said about physics and those gender issues. It has been a persistent problem that's still there. So, did you notice anything with any other subject areas in particular, or is it really just physics and IT kind of
Well, there was a few odd people said, oh, how was the only boy in the drama class, or there's a little bit of it. But I think that there's a lot of really good people, as you know, working in that area of gender and equality. But thinking back to the project we did in the mid-90s, it was about the gender pipeline into industry, and the women in IT was where and to look at the pathways into industry, we're looking at university, we're looking at senior years, we're looking at middle years. That we had to look at year 9 and 10 electives, and we really should have gone earlier than that. So if you've only got 3 girls choosing physics in year 11, then how much earlier in their schooling, you might say primary school MASH, how much earlier in their schooling have they got the idea that this is not for them? Because I don't believe, that the 28 boys, to go back to my first day teaching, 28 boys and 3 girls in a year 10 English class, I don't think that that's the distribution of verbal and, literacy intelligence in those cohorts properly represented. So we could talk for hours. Sorry about that. Does anybody who's online have a question or a challenge? Any others can you think of around curriculum specifically?
There's the woodwork maybe.
Oh, woodwork, that's right. There was a great school in the ACT. So we had schools in the ACT, these 3 colleges. We're so grateful to them. They were so wonderful, where there was a woman woodwork teacher who was very proactive and put a lot of effort into. They come to the school for year 11, so we don't know their histories before that. But she'd also worked in high schools, hadn't she? And she talked about how she actively promotes and encourages and seeks out the girls to boost them and give them, because it is a space where they don't feel that general tendency is that it's not their space. And she talked about, maybe the student even talked about that.
One of the students talked about the difference between place she came, I think.
Yeah, and the detail and the fine attention to detail that she sees. If you're going to have a gendered attribute, then the fine detail, that attention to detail that she's able to bring. What else? We had a lot of students also. I've been looking at the single-sex school data, and it was pretty interesting to see, as I said, they're from government schools and from, because we have those, so many of them in New South Wales, and there was a tendency for subjects not to be offered in the girls' school in the high. So quite a few of them said, we didn't have enough students to run that subject, so it didn't run, or we had to go over to the boys' school to do that subject. Physics might have been the one they said, and we had a heap of students doing biology. But so to go, if you've got to go to the boys' school to do it, that's another, to me, subtle reinforcement of that's not your space. You've got to cross the oval and go into the boys' school with the boys' teacher. You don't know that teacher so well. In a perfect world, if there were 3 girls wanting to do physics, you'd run a class. But that's not how staffing works. What would happen if the boys came over to the girls' school to teach physics? 28 of them trooped over to the girls' school. That would be an interesting little experiment. So one of the things we said in this, I don't know if we'll be able to do it, but one of the things we said in our proposal was that we'd really look at the materialities of gendered experience. Uniforms is one, how space is used, different versions of this grant application had even guided walks around the school with students leading us and talking about how the space is organised. But that's one of the many that didn't get up as we kept changing the project design. And really, by the time we got it, it was like, oh my gosh, we're so exhausted from the multiple applications. How can we? And then COVID happened. So the timing was absolutely perfect for us to be hit with the impossibility of doing research in schools during COVID in New South Wales. And also, I must say, a hostile political environment from conservative political forces. Thank you. Anything else? I hope I have some answers in a while. Yes?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Ingrid. I'm from the mental health and wellbeing team.
Oh, Ingrid.
Hi,
Goodness.
nice to hear you as well. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say thank you. I was really interested in your work and the implications of your research, particularly the institutional structures and reduce through that. And then, my main reference point is looking at how this impacts on our health and wellbeing, and then how that translates in the university environment. So, yeah, just thoughts and reflections. I don't really have a specific question. But I guess I'll go into further reading. So,
It's very interesting. I remember some of the university students told us, we spoke to people, because we were so worried about the school, our capacity to go into schools, and because this was funded research, the risk was high that we wouldn't be able to do a portion of it. I was very nervous about that. So we kept going back. We did a lot of rounds of 3 years, I think, of going back to the uni students and recruiting a few more, because we thought, at least we can say we had the same numbers of participants. And so there were people who were in their first year in 2021, 2020, 2022. Gosh. Oh, it's been so long. So who'd done their last year of school in COVID even. But what was my point? There were students who said they had never been in a tutorial group with that. They'd never learnt alongside a student who was male before they came to university. It was very unnerving for people who'd come from a single-sex school to be in a classroom, in a tutorial group with the sort of activities we do with people who they'd really had their school education reinforcing for them were opposite, different from them. So that was a real transition. What other things did we were really surprised. I noticed just outside the door there, we've got the Respect Now Always poster up. They had just gone up. We had this huge campaign about the same time, just before we started interviewing these students. Had any of them seen them? Nope. Did they know about it? Nope. Maybe we don't know enough about the gaps in knowledge and understanding and comfort and ease in the students who come to our university. But quite a few of them said, there was a really interesting quote from a guy I took out who said, how did it go? That in my area, in my local region, Bankstown sort of area, the social sciences haven't really influenced the community. It's a very, what can I say, traditional community, he said. A lot of people have encountered really new ideas about gender, but also about themselves and their ways of seeing the world when they got to university. And we probably don't know enough about that to help them with that transition. It's a really radically different environment for a lot of students. I don't know, is that fair? Ingrid, more than anyone. People who are first year advisors, people in the mental health and counselling, you probably see that more than these little glimpses we had of, you've come from, we know high school to uni is already a huge thing, as it was for me, first in family, away from home. It's always huge, but it's maybe even huger than we think, and there's more parameters to it. I don't know. That might be just a bit of a bland statement, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe we should go and have a really close look at what they've said is different, really different, and shocked them at university. A lot of them talked about what they'd learned in different subjects, in law and criminology. They'd really had revelations about how the world is that had never occurred to them before.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm like very, very interested. I started my career as a teacher also. So yeah, so much to think about. So thank you very much. And to your colleague.
Okay, thank you. I think there's some sandwiches there at the back.
Thank you.
Very much, everybody, for coming. Everybody who came online. I know it's I never want to. Yep. Thank you so much for coming. Bye bye.